You wake up tired before the day even begins, carrying invisible pressure in your chest, trying to be everything for everyone, trying to smile through exhaustion, trying to prove your worth in kitchens, offices, classrooms, relationships, meetings, and quiet, lonely nights where no one sees the tears you wipe away before sleep. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that being strong meant staying silent, that being lovable meant being perfect, that being respected meant never falling apart. Yet the more you hid your fears, the heavier your heart became. Because pretending to have it all together is one of the most exhausting performances a human soul can endure. You learn to apologize for your emotions, to shrink your voice in rooms that made you feel small, to overthink every text message, every mistake, every opinion, every flaw, until anxiety became a background noise you no longer questioned, and slowly, without realizing it, you disconnected from your authentic self, from the radiant and emotionally free person who once existed beneath the layers of people-pleasing, perfectionism, self-doubt, and fear of judgment. And yet, even inside that exhaustion, there is still something alive within you, something courageous, something quietly whispering that you were never meant to spend your life hiding. Because vulnerability is not weakness, it is the birthplace of connection, healing, self-love, and emotional freedom. The world may have taught you that softness is dangerous, that tears make you fragile, that asking for help means failure. But the truth is, the strongest hearts are often the ones brave enough to feel deeply, to love openly, to begin again after heartbreak, to trust after disappointment, to stand in uncertainty without abandoning themselves. Every moment you allow yourself to be seen honestly, every time you say no when your soul needs rest, every time you choose self-respect over approval, you reclaim another piece of your feminine strength, another piece of your inner peace, another piece of the powerful woman who was never truly lost, only buried beneath shame and survival. You were never supposed to carry the burden of becoming enough, because you already are enough, worthy before the achievements, worthy before the validation, worthy before the compliments, worthy even on the days when you feel uncertain, emotional, anxious, or broken. The fear that tells you to hide your scars is the same fear that keeps genuine connection away, because healing begins the moment you stop performing and start allowing yourself to exist authentically. Real confidence is not loud perfection. It is emotional honesty. It is self-trust. It is the graceful power of standing in your truth without needing everyone to approve of it. And when you begin embracing imperfection instead of fighting it, something extraordinary happens. Your nervous system softens, your relationships deepen, your voice becomes clearer, and your heart no longer feels trapped inside the exhausting race of comparison. There will still be moments when vulnerability feels terrifying, moments when your voice shakes, moments when rejection stings, moments when old wounds reopen. But emotional courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to move forward while fear is present. It is choosing wholehearted living over emotional numbness. It is daring greatly in a world that constantly tells you to stay guarded. And that is why this audiobook matters, because it is not here to make you perfect. It is here to help you become emotionally empowered, resilient, deeply connected, emotionally grounded, and unapologetically authentic. It is here to help you heal the hidden shame that has convinced you that you must constantly prove your value. It is here to remind you that your emotions are not liabilities, your sensitivity is not weakness, your softness is not something to fix, and your story is not something to hide. As you continue listening, you will begin to understand how vulnerability can become your greatest source of self-belief, how emotional openness can transform your relationships, how boundaries can protect your peace, and how fearless authenticity can lead you back to the self you were always meant to become, a woman filled with emotional wisdom, self-acceptance, confidence, courage, and the quiet, radiant certainty that no matter what life asks of you, you no longer need to abandon yourself in order to belong. Chapter 1. Scarcity. Looking inside our culture of never enough. There is a silent sentence that follows millions of people every single day. A sentence so deeply wired into the modern mind that most people no longer notice it. Yet it shapes their confidence, relationships, emotions, choices, and even the way they look at themselves in the mirror. And that sentence is this: I am not enough. Not successful enough. Not beautiful enough. Not productive enough. Not calm enough. Not lovable enough. Not perfect enough. Not extraordinary enough. You wake up already feeling behind, already comparing, already measuring your worth against impossible standards before your feet even touch the floor. And slowly this pressure begins to feel normal until exhaustion becomes your personality and overthinking becomes your inner language. You smile while carrying emotional heaviness no one sees. You scroll through polished lives online and quietly wonder why everyone else seems happier, stronger, more confident, more fulfilled, and without realizing it, you begin abandoning your authentic self just to keep up with a world addicted to perfection. And the painful part is not only the pressure itself, it is the loneliness that comes with it. Because scarcity does not simply whisper that you need more, it convinces you that who you are right now can never truly be enough. It turns life into emotional survival, where you constantly prove, perform, fix, improve, hide, and compare, while your nervous system quietly begs for rest. You begin believing that if you finally become prettier, calmer, more accomplished, more liked, more emotionally controlled, then maybe you will deserve peace. Maybe then you will feel worthy. Maybe then you will stop fearing rejection. But the finish line keeps moving, because scarcity is not a goal you achieve. It is a mindset that feeds on your insecurity and grows stronger every time you tie your self-worth to outside validation. You can see it everywhere: in the woman who feels guilty for resting, in the mother who believes every mistake makes her a failure, in the professional woman terrified of not being impressive enough, in the emotionally exhausted person who says yes to everyone because disappointing others feels unbearable, in the woman healing from heartbreak who secretly believes she was too much or not enough to be loved properly. Scarcity teaches you to disconnect from your own emotional wisdom and replace it with performance, comparison, and perfectionism. And the more disconnected you become from yourself, the more vulnerable you feel to judgment, criticism, rejection, and shame. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that many people try to protect themselves from these painful feelings by pretending they are above vulnerability, by becoming emotionally guarded, hyper-independent, controlling, perfectionistic, or emotionally unavailable. Yet beneath all of those protective layers is often the same frightened thought: what if I am ordinary? And what if ordinary means unworthy? That fear silently shapes relationships, leadership, parenting, friendships, creativity, and even self-love. You begin shrinking your voice to avoid criticism, hiding your emotions to avoid looking weak, and editing your true self to fit into spaces that were never meant for your authenticity. But the truth that changes everything is this: your worth was never supposed to be earned through exhaustion. Your value does not increase when you suffer more, achieve more, sacrifice more, or become more acceptable to everyone else. You are worthy because you exist, because your heart is capable of love, because your soul was never designed to become a machine constantly chasing approval. And once you begin understanding this, something inside you starts softening. The constant emotional tension begins loosening its grip. You stop seeing vulnerability as weakness and begin recognizing it as emotional courage. You realize that the most powerful woman in the room is often the one who no longer needs to pretend she has everything figured out. Scarcity survives through shame, comparison, and emotional disconnection. Shame tells you that your struggles make you unlovable. Comparison tells you everyone else is ahead of you. Disconnection tells you to hide your truth instead of sharing it. And when these three forces combine, they slowly drain your emotional resilience, your self-trust, and your inner peace. You become emotionally exhausted not because you are weak, but because carrying emotional armor every day is heavy. Pretending to be fine when you are overwhelmed is heavy. Constantly performing confidence while secretly doubting yourself is heavy. Trying to earn love through perfection is heavy. And this is where emotional healing begins, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming honest. Honest about your fears, your needs, your emotions, your exhaustion, your longing to feel safe inside your own heart again. Real transformation starts when you stop asking, "How do I become enough?" and begin asking, "What if I already am?" Because that question changes the entire direction of your healing journey. Suddenly, boundaries stop feeling selfish and start feeling sacred. Rest stops feeling lazy and starts feeling necessary. Saying no stops feeling cruel and starts feeling emotionally grounded. Vulnerability stops feeling dangerous and starts becoming the bridge to deeper connection, trust, and self-respect. You do not heal by becoming harder. You heal by becoming more connected to yourself, by allowing your emotions to exist without shame, by understanding that softness is strength, by recognizing that emotionally aware people are not fragile people, they are courageous people. It takes immense feminine resilience to remain open-hearted in a world that rewards emotional numbness. It takes graceful power to choose authenticity over performance. It takes a brave heart to let yourself be seen without constantly editing your humanity. And maybe the deepest freedom of all is realizing that your life does not need to look extraordinary in order to be meaningful. You do not need to constantly impress people to deserve belonging. You do not need to win every comparison to be worthy of love. The culture around you may continue shouting that you must always become more, achieve more, prove more, but your healing begins the moment you step away from that noise and return to your own emotional truth. Because enoughness is not something the world gives you. It is something you choose to believe about yourself. As this understanding settles deeper into your heart, you begin noticing subtle but life-changing shifts. Your relationships become more authentic because you stop performing perfection. Your confidence becomes more stable because it no longer depends entirely on praise. Your emotional world becomes calmer because you stop fighting your own humanity. And slowly, almost quietly, you begin reclaiming your voice, your self-belief, your emotional freedom, your wholehearted presence, and the radiant self that scarcity once convinced you to hide. Chapter 2. Debunking the Vulnerability Myths. The hardest truth you may ever admit to yourself is not that you are overwhelmed, anxious, emotionally exhausted, or even heartbroken. The hardest truth is realizing how much of your life has been spent hiding. Hiding your fears behind productivity, hiding your sadness behind a smile, hiding your loneliness behind independence, hiding your emotional needs behind the sentence, "I'm fine." And after years of doing this, you begin forgetting what your real voice even sounds like. You become so skilled at carrying pain privately that vulnerability starts feeling dangerous, almost forbidden, because somewhere along the way you were taught that strong people do not cry openly, confident people do not need reassurance, successful women do not fall apart, and emotionally intelligent people should always remain composed. So you learn to survive by becoming emotionally armored, polished on the outside while quietly overwhelmed inside. And the tragedy is that the more disconnected you become from your authentic emotions, the more disconnected you become from yourself. You can feel this disconnection in everyday moments, in the way you hesitate before expressing your needs, in the way you rehearse difficult conversations in your mind for hours, in the way you say yes when your soul is screaming no, in the way you apologize for your emotions before anyone even reacts to them. Vulnerability begins to feel like weakness because the world often rewards appearances over honesty. It celebrates perfection while silently punishing emotional openness. And because of that, many people spend years believing the biggest myth of all, that vulnerability makes you fragile, when in reality vulnerability is the birthplace of courage, connection, self-respect, emotional freedom, and wholehearted living. Think about the moments that changed your life most deeply, the moments when your heart was truly involved, falling in love without guarantees, becoming a mother and suddenly realizing how deeply you could fear losing someone, starting over after heartbreak, trusting someone again after betrayal, speaking your truth in a room where you feared judgment, walking away from a relationship that slowly erased your self-worth, beginning a new career when self-doubt whispered that you were not capable enough, admitting you needed help when you spent your whole life pretending to be strong. None of those moments were comfortable. Every single one carried uncertainty, emotional exposure, and risk. Yet those are also the moments where your deepest emotional growth began. That is what vulnerability really is. It is uncertainty. It is emotional exposure. It is showing up without controlling the outcome. And because humans naturally crave certainty, many people spend their lives trying to avoid vulnerability completely. They become perfectionists because perfection feels safer than criticism. They become people pleasers because rejection feels unbearable. They become emotionally distant because attachment feels risky. They become hyper-independent because depending on someone once hurt too much. And although these behaviors may temporarily protect the heart, they also slowly suffocate it. Emotional armor may protect you from pain, but it also blocks intimacy, trust, joy, creativity, love, and deep connection. You may have noticed this already in your own life. How the moments when you guarded yourself the most were often the moments you felt the loneliest. Because connection is impossible without emotional honesty. You cannot experience true belonging while constantly performing a version of yourself designed to be accepted. Real belonging only begins the moment you allow yourself to be seen authentically, flaws included, fears included, imperfections included. And that is terrifying, because authenticity asks you to stop controlling how people perceive you. It asks you to risk being misunderstood. It asks you to trust that your worth does not disappear simply because someone fails to recognize it. One of the most painful emotional contradictions you may carry is this: you admire vulnerability in others while rejecting it in yourself. When someone cries honestly, speaks vulnerably, admits fear, tells the truth about their struggles, or courageously starts over, you often see bravery, humanity, and emotional strength. Yet when you are the one trembling emotionally, suddenly vulnerability feels embarrassing. You tell yourself that your emotions are too much, your fears are inconvenient, your imperfections are proof that you are failing. And this contradiction quietly shapes so many lives. You crave deep connection, but you fear being fully seen. You long for intimacy, but you hide the very parts of yourself that create intimacy. This is why emotional healing is not simply about learning positive thoughts. It is about learning emotional courage. It is about staying emotionally present instead of emotionally armored. It is about allowing yourself to exist honestly even when certainty is unavailable. Because there is no version of life where vulnerability disappears. Love is vulnerable. Leadership is vulnerable. Motherhood is vulnerable. Creativity is vulnerable. Trust is vulnerable. Healing is vulnerable. Existing as a human being with a heart is vulnerable. And yet, despite this truth, many people still say, "I do not do vulnerability." But vulnerability is not something you choose to participate in occasionally like a hobby. Vulnerability is already happening every single day. Every time you care deeply about something, vulnerability is present. Every time you hope, trust, love, dream, attach, create, forgive, or begin again, vulnerability is already there. The real question is not whether vulnerability exists in your life. The real question is how you respond to it. Do you meet vulnerability with emotional openness? Or do you meet it with control, perfectionism, numbness, anger, people-pleasing, avoidance, or emotional withdrawal? And this question matters deeply because your protective patterns eventually become emotional prisons. The woman who constantly needs to appear strong often struggles privately with exhaustion and loneliness. The woman who avoids emotional closeness to prevent heartbreak often feels disconnected and unseen. The woman obsessed with perfection often loses herself trying to earn love through achievement. The woman who never expresses disappointment slowly becomes resentful. The woman who fears judgment silences her own voice until she no longer recognizes herself. Healing begins when you stop seeing these patterns as personality traits and begin recognizing them as protection strategies created by fear. Perfectionism is often fear wearing makeup. People-pleasing is often abandonment fear disguised as kindness. Emotional numbness is often pain searching for safety. Control is often anxiety trying to survive uncertainty. And once you begin understanding this with compassion rather than shame, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop attacking yourself for being sensitive. You stop calling yourself weak for feeling deeply. You stop seeing your emotional needs as inconveniences. Instead, you begin responding to yourself with emotional wisdom, self-acceptance, and grace. And this grace becomes especially important when you realize that vulnerability is not the same as oversharing. Emotional honesty without boundaries is not healing. It is emotional flooding. Real vulnerability requires trust, emotional safety, mutual respect, and discernment. It means understanding that not everyone has earned access to your deepest wounds. Your story is sacred. Your pain deserves care, not careless exposure. There is strength in emotional openness, but there is also strength in boundaries. Healthy vulnerability says, I will allow myself to be seen honestly, but I will also protect my emotional well-being with wisdom. This balance changes relationships profoundly. Instead of desperately seeking validation from emotionally unavailable people, you begin recognizing who is emotionally safe. Instead of forcing yourself to stay emotionally silent just to maintain peace, you begin expressing your truth calmly and courageously. Instead of shrinking your personality to avoid rejection, you begin understanding that rejection is sometimes protection. And slowly, your relationships become more emotionally grounded because they are built on authenticity rather than performance. You may also begin noticing how often shame has controlled your emotional world without you even realizing it. Shame is not simply feeling bad about something you did. Shame whispers something much deeper and far more painful. It says, there is something wrong with me. And once shame takes root, vulnerability becomes terrifying because you fear that if people truly see you, they will leave. So you perform confidence while secretly doubting your worth. You overachieve while quietly feeling inadequate. You care for everyone else while neglecting yourself. You become emotionally exhausted trying to outrun feelings of unworthiness. But shame cannot survive empathy and truth. The moment you speak honestly about your struggles in safe relationships, shame begins losing power. The moment you stop hiding your humanity, healing begins. Because emotional freedom does not come from becoming flawless. It comes from realizing your flaws never disqualified you from love in the first place. And perhaps this is one of the most liberating truths you will ever hear. You do not have to become fearless before living fully. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that your authentic life matters more than your fear of judgment. Courage is allowing yourself to start again after failure. Courage is setting boundaries even when people misunderstand you. Courage is asking for help when your heart feels heavy. Courage is saying, this hurt me. Courage is letting someone love the real you instead of the polished version you created for approval. The beautiful thing about emotional courage is that it grows slowly through practice. Every time you choose honesty over performance, your self-trust deepens. Every time you allow yourself to rest without guilt, your nervous system heals. Every time you express your needs respectfully, your confidence strengthens. Every time you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, your inner strength expands. And eventually, vulnerability no longer feels like a terrifying exposure. It begins feeling like liberation. You start speaking differently to yourself. Softer, kinder, more compassionate. You stop seeing your sensitivity as weakness and begin recognizing it as emotional intelligence. You stop punishing yourself for needing connection. You stop apologizing for having boundaries. You stop believing that worthiness must be earned through suffering. And in that emotional shift, your entire life begins transforming from the inside out. Your relationships become more authentic because you are no longer pretending constantly. Your career becomes more fulfilling because you stop building your identity solely around external achievement. Your motherhood becomes more emotionally connected because your children no longer see perfection. They see humanity, honesty, resilience, and self-respect. Your friendships deepen because vulnerability creates intimacy that performance never can. And perhaps most importantly, your relationship with yourself becomes safer, calmer, more loving, more emotionally grounded. You begin noticing beauty in imperfection instead of constantly trying to erase it. You allow yourself to be human without seeing humanity as failure. You stop chasing the impossible standard of being endlessly composed, endlessly productive, endlessly agreeable, endlessly strong. Instead, you become real, wholehearted, present, emotionally aware, deeply connected to yourself. And even though vulnerability will always feel uncomfortable at times, something inside you changes when you stop running from it. You realize that emotional exposure is not the enemy. Emotional disconnection is. You realize that the moments you felt most alive were often the moments you dared greatly despite uncertainty. The moments you opened your heart again after pain. The moments you trusted your voice despite fear. The moments you chose authenticity over approval. Because at the end of the day, the goal is not to create a perfectly protected life where you never risk emotional pain. The goal is to create a life where you no longer abandon yourself in order to avoid pain. A life where your self-worth is no longer controlled entirely by outside validation. A life where your softness coexists with your strength. A life where your emotions are honored instead of hidden. A life where your courage is measured not by how emotionless you become, but by how fully you allow yourself to love, connect, trust, heal, and be seen. And maybe that is the quiet miracle vulnerability offers, not perfection, not certainty, not immunity from heartbreak, but something far more meaningful, the ability to finally come home to yourself, emotionally free, deeply connected, resilient, authentic, and no longer afraid of your own humanity. Chapter 3. Understanding and Combating Shame. There are wounds that do not leave bruises on the skin, wounds so invisible that the world keeps moving around you while your heart quietly carries the weight of them every single day. And one of the deepest of those wounds is shame. Shame is not loud in the beginning. It does not enter your life announcing itself with chaos. It arrives slowly, quietly, almost politely, through small moments that seem harmless at first. A dismissive comment about your body, a relationship that made you feel difficult to love, a childhood where emotions were treated like inconveniences, a teacher who embarrassed you in front of others, a parent who only praised achievement, a betrayal that made you question your worth, a heartbreak that convinced you that you were not enough to stay for. And little by little, those moments begin, forming a hidden story inside your mind, a story that says, "Something about me is wrong." And once that story settles into your nervous system, it changes everything. The way you love, the way you trust, the way you speak, the way you shrink yourself, the way you apologize for existing, The way you chase perfection because being flawless feels safer than being judged. And the devastating part about shame is that it thrives in silence. It grows strongest in the hidden corners of your life, in the thoughts you never say out loud, in the tears you wipe away before anyone sees them, in the smile you force while secretly feeling emotionally exhausted, in the moments when you compare your behind-the-scenes pain to everyone else's polished image and wonder why being human feels so heavy for you. Shame convinces you that if people truly saw your insecurities, your fears, your emotional wounds, your mistakes, your sensitivity, your anxiety, they would reject you. So you begin protecting yourself. You become more agreeable, more pleasing, more perfect, more emotionally guarded. You become the woman who constantly gives but secretly feels unseen. The woman who looks confident while battling self-doubt privately. The woman who says, "I'm okay," even when her heart feels shattered. The woman who performs strength because vulnerability feels too risky. And eventually, without realizing it, you stop living authentically and start living defensively. Your choices become shaped by fear instead of self-trust. You stop asking yourself, "What do I truly want?" and begin asking, "What will make me accepted?" You begin editing your personality in relationships, filtering your emotions, suppressing your needs, tolerating disrespect, overworking for validation, and abandoning your emotional truth just to avoid feeling unworthy. Shame slowly disconnects you from yourself, and the longer this disconnection continues, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before fear taught you to shrink. You can see the fingerprints of shame everywhere once you begin noticing them. In perfectionism, in people-pleasing, in comparison, in anxiety, in the constant pressure to prove your value, in the fear of failure that keeps you from trying, in the fear of judgment that keeps you silent, in the fear of rejection that keeps you emotionally unavailable. Shame is often the invisible force behind emotional exhaustion because carrying a false version of yourself every day is heavy. Pretending not to care is heavy. Pretending not to hurt is heavy. Pretending to have everything under control while silently struggling is heavy. And perhaps one of the cruelest things shame does is convince you that your pain makes you weak, when in reality your pain is often proof of how deeply you have loved, hoped, trusted, and survived. Your sensitivity is not evidence that something is wrong with you. Your emotional depth is not a flaw. The world may have rewarded emotional numbness and praised people for appearing detached and invulnerable, but true emotional strength has never been about becoming harder. Real strength is allowing yourself to remain soft without allowing the world to destroy your self-worth. Real courage is staying emotionally open after disappointment. Real feminine resilience is learning how to protect your peace without abandoning your heart. The problem is that shame hates vulnerability because vulnerability threatens its survival. Shame wants you isolated, silent, disconnected, and hidden. It wants you believing that you are the only person struggling. It wants you performing perfection instead of asking for support. It wants you trapped inside comparison because comparison keeps you distracted from self-acceptance. Shame says, "Do not let them see the real you." But healing begins the moment you stop obeying that voice. This is why emotional honesty becomes revolutionary. The moment you speak your truth in a safe space, shame loses some of its power. The moment you say, "I am struggling," instead of pretending everything is fine, your nervous system begins releasing years of emotional tension. The moment you allow yourself to be seen authentically, flaws included, fears included, emotions included, something extraordinary happens. You realize that vulnerability does not destroy connection, it creates it. Think about the relationships that feel safest to you. The people who make you feel emotionally held, emotionally grounded, emotionally free to be yourself. Those relationships are rarely built through perfection. They are built through honesty, through emotional openness, through empathy, through the courage to say, "This is who I really am." Because true intimacy can never grow where performance is required. If someone only loves the polished version of you, they are not truly connected to you. They are connected to your mask. And this realization changes the way you move through life. You begin understanding that your worthiness is not conditional. It does not disappear when you make mistakes. It does not disappear when you fail, cry, disappoint someone, gain weight, lose a relationship, feel anxious, struggle emotionally, or need support. Shame says, if I fail, I am a failure. But emotional wisdom says, I can fail and still be worthy of love. That distinction changes everything because it separates your humanity from your value. You begin noticing how much shame has shaped your relationships. Maybe you stayed too long in situations where you felt emotionally neglected because a part of you believed you should be grateful for any love at all. Maybe you tolerated criticism because deep down you already criticized yourself harsher than anyone else ever could. Maybe you became hyper-independent because needing people once made you feel unsafe. Maybe you learned to overgive because you feared that being yourself would never feel like enough. And once these patterns become visible, healing finally becomes possible. Healing shame does not happen through punishment. It happens through compassion, through emotional awareness, through learning how to speak to yourself differently, through replacing self-criticism with curiosity, through understanding that your coping mechanisms were survival strategies, not evidence of failure. You were not weak for becoming guarded. You were trying to survive emotional pain. You were not dramatic for feeling deeply. You were carrying emotions without support. You were not too much. You were simply longing to be understood without shame. And slowly, as self-compassion grows, your inner world begins changing. You stop seeing your emotions as enemies. You stop apologizing for taking up emotional space. You stop believing that love must be earned through exhaustion and sacrifice. You begin understanding that boundaries are not rejection, they are self-respect. Saying no becomes an act of emotional healing. Rest becomes an act of self-trust. Walking away from emotionally harmful situations becomes an act of courage instead of guilt. There is also a powerful shift that happens when you begin recognizing shame triggers in real time. A comment that once would have spiraled you into self-hatred now becomes an opportunity for awareness. You notice the tightening in your chest, the urge to withdraw, the instinct to perform perfection, and instead of abandoning yourself emotionally, you pause. You breathe. You remind yourself that discomfort does not equal unworthiness. You begin grounding yourself in truth rather than fear. And this practice slowly builds shame resilience, the ability to experience vulnerability without collapsing into self-rejection. Shame resilience is not becoming immune to emotional pain. It is learning how to move through pain without losing yourself inside it. It is learning how to stay emotionally connected to yourself during difficult moments. It is having the courage to reach for support instead of isolation. It is allowing empathy to interrupt the cycle of self-judgment. Because empathy is one of the most healing emotional experiences a human being can receive. To feel seen without being shamed, to feel heard without being fixed, to feel accepted without performing. That kind of connection can heal wounds that words alone never could. And perhaps this is why vulnerability feels so transformative once you stop fearing it. Vulnerability allows you to stop carrying your emotional world alone. It allows you to be human instead of constantly trying to appear invincible. It allows you to experience relationships where your real self is welcome. It allows you to reclaim parts of yourself shame convinced you to hide. Your sensitivity, your voice, your dreams, your emotional needs, your softness, your truth. You may begin noticing that the more self-acceptance you practice, the less power external validation has over your emotional stability. Compliments become enjoyable rather than necessary. Criticism becomes information rather than identity. Rejection becomes redirection rather than proof of inadequacy. You stop chasing approval from emotionally unavailable people because your self-worth no longer depends entirely on being chosen by others. And this emotional shift creates an entirely different kind of confidence. Not performative confidence, not loud confidence, but grounded confidence. The kind that comes from no longer abandoning yourself. This grounded confidence changes the energy you bring into every part of your life. In relationships, you stop begging for bare minimum effort because your self-respect becomes stronger than your fear of being alone. In leadership, you stop needing to appear perfect and begin leading with emotional authenticity. In motherhood, you stop trying to be flawless and begin showing your children what emotional honesty and resilience look like. In friendships, you stop pretending everything is fine and begin creating real connection through truth. In your inner world, you stop treating yourself like a project that constantly needs fixing and begin treating yourself like someone worthy of care. And still, there will be moments when shame tries to return. Old wounds do not disappear overnight. Certain experiences will still trigger insecurity. Certain disappointments will still hurt deeply. There will still be days when comparison feels loud, when fear whispers that you are not enough, when vulnerability feels terrifying again. But the difference now is that you no longer automatically believe those voices. You recognize them as echoes of old pain rather than permanent truth. You begin responding to yourself differently during hard moments. Instead of spiraling into self-hatred, you offer yourself compassion. Instead of hiding emotionally, you reach toward connection. Instead of numbing your feelings, you allow yourself to feel them safely. Instead of demanding perfection, you honor progress. And with every small act of emotional courage, your relationship with yourself becomes more secure, more loving, more emotionally grounded. The most beautiful part of healing shame is that it reconnects you with your humanity. You stop trying to become less emotional and begin becoming more emotionally intelligent. You stop fearing your sensitivity and begin recognizing it as emotional depth. You stop seeing vulnerability as weakness and begin understanding it as the birthplace of intimacy, courage, creativity, trust, and wholehearted living. And perhaps, after years of carrying shame quietly, the greatest freedom of all is realizing that you were never broken beyond repair. You were never unworthy of love. You were never too sensitive, too emotional, too imperfect, too complicated, or too much. You were simply human in a world that taught you to fear your humanity. But your healing journey begins the moment you stop seeing your humanity as something to hide and start seeing it as something sacred. Because your story does not become powerful when all the pain disappears. Your story becomes powerful when you stop letting shame define your identity. When you begin standing inside your truth with softness instead of self-rejection. When you begin trusting that your worth exists independently of perfection. When you begin allowing yourself to be seen authentically without apologizing for your existence. And slowly, almost gently, you begin becoming emotionally free. Not because life suddenly becomes painless, but because you are no longer fighting yourself while living it. Your heart softens. Your voice strengthens. Your boundaries deepen. Your relationships become more honest. Your self-trust grows steadier. And somewhere along this healing journey, you finally realize that becoming enough was never the goal, because beneath all the shame, beneath all the fear, beneath all the years spent proving yourself, you were already worthy from the very beginning. Chapter 4: The Vulnerability Armory. There comes a moment in life when you realize that the exhaustion you feel is not only coming from the outside world, it is also coming from the constant effort of protecting yourself. Protecting your heart from disappointment, your emotions from judgment, your dreams from failure, your softness from rejection, your truth from criticism. And after years of doing this, your protection no longer feels like a choice. It feels like survival. You begin building invisible emotional armor without even noticing it, layer by layer, experience by experience, heartbreak after heartbreak, Until one day you wake up emotionally guarded in places where you once felt open, cautious in places where you once felt alive, disconnected in places where you once felt deeply connected. And the painful irony is that the armor you built to keep pain out slowly begins keeping love, intimacy, joy, trust, and emotional freedom out as well. You may recognize this armor in your own life already. It appears in the woman who laughs everything off because being serious feels too vulnerable. It appears in the woman who constantly stays busy because silence forces her to feel emotions she has been avoiding for years. It appears in the woman who needs to appear perfect because mistakes trigger unbearable shame. It appears in the woman who becomes emotionally unavailable after betrayal because loving openly once hurt too deeply. It appears in the woman who overachieves because achievement feels safer than emotional intimacy. It appears in the woman who constantly says, "I don't care," while secretly longing to be chosen, understood, and emotionally safe. And what makes this emotional armor so dangerous is that it often disguises itself as strength. The world praises people for being emotionally detached, endlessly productive, hyper-independent, always composed, always in control. So you begin believing that your healing depends on becoming harder, less emotional, less sensitive, less vulnerable. But real healing does not happen through emotional numbness. Emotional numbness may temporarily reduce pain, but it also reduces connection, joy, creativity, passion, intimacy, and the ability to feel fully alive. You cannot selectively numb emotions. When you shut down vulnerability to avoid heartbreak, you also shut down your ability to experience deep love. When you numb disappointment, you also numb excitement. When you silence fear, you often silence courage as well. This is why so many emotionally exhausted people secretly feel disconnected even while appearing successful. They have mastered survival but forgotten how to feel emotionally free. Their lives look polished on the outside while their inner world feels tense, lonely, anxious, and emotionally overprotected. And perhaps you have felt this too, the strange ache of being surrounded by people yet still feeling unseen, the exhaustion of constantly managing how others perceive you, the pressure to always seem strong while your heart quietly begs for rest. One of the most common forms of emotional armor is perfectionism. And despite what many people believe, perfectionism is not really about high standards. It is about protection. It is the desperate hope that if you become flawless enough, successful enough, attractive enough, accomplished enough, emotionally controlled enough, then maybe you can avoid criticism, rejection, disappointment, and shame. Perfectionism whispers, "If I look perfect, maybe no one will see how insecure I feel." But perfectionism is a painful trap because it turns your worth into a performance. No achievement ever feels like enough. No success fully quiets the fear underneath. You keep chasing approval while feeling increasingly disconnected from yourself. And the heartbreaking part is that perfectionism often receives applause from the outside world. People praise your discipline, your productivity, your competence, your ability to handle everything. They may never realize that beneath that polished image is someone terrified of failure, terrified of disappointing others, terrified of being seen as inadequate. You begin living as though rest must be earned, as though mistakes are dangerous, as though vulnerability would somehow erase your value. And over time, this mindset creates emotional burnout because your nervous system was never designed to live under constant pressure to prove worthiness. You may also notice another form of emotional armor hiding inside people-pleasing. At first, people-pleasing can look kind, generous, selfless, easygoing. But underneath it often lives a deep fear of rejection and disconnection. You become hyper-aware of everyone else's emotions while ignoring your own. You say yes when your soul needs no. You overextend yourself emotionally because disappointing people feels terrifying. You shrink your truth to maintain peace. You become so focused on being liked that you slowly lose connection with what you genuinely feel and need. And eventually, resentment begins growing quietly inside you. Not because you are selfish, but because self-abandonment is exhausting. The more you betray your own emotional truth to keep others comfortable, the more disconnected you become from your authentic self. Real connection cannot grow where performance replaces honesty. Real intimacy requires emotional presence, boundaries, and self-respect. There is another form of armor that many emotionally strong people carry without realizing it, and that is emotional numbing through busyness. Modern life makes this incredibly easy. You stay distracted constantly, scrolling, working, cleaning, multitasking, consuming content, overcommitting yourself, always moving, always doing, because slowing down means feeling. And feeling can seem terrifying when your heart has spent years carrying unprocessed grief, disappointment, loneliness, shame, or emotional neglect. So you stay busy enough to avoid hearing your own inner voice. But eventually your body begins speaking what your emotions have been trying to say all along. Anxiety increases. Exhaustion deepens. Relationships feel disconnected. Joy feels harder to access. You may feel emotionally flat even during beautiful moments. And this happens because your nervous system is craving emotional honesty, not endless distraction. Healing begins when you allow yourself to pause long enough to ask, what am I truly feeling beneath all this noise? And sometimes what you discover beneath the noise is grief. Grief for the version of yourself you abandoned in order to survive. Grief for the years spent proving your worth. Grief for relationships where you loved harder than you were loved back. Grief for the emotional safety you never received. Grief for the softness you buried because the world taught you vulnerability was dangerous. But this grief is not weakness. It is emotional truth finally asking to be acknowledged. Many people also use cynicism as armor. They stop believing in love, trust, vulnerability, or emotional intimacy because disappointment once hurt too deeply. They convince themselves they no longer care because caring feels too risky. But cynicism is often wounded hope disguised as wisdom. Beneath emotional detachment is usually someone who once loved deeply and was hurt deeply. And while emotional walls may feel safer, they also prevent the possibility of genuine connection. This is why emotional courage matters so profoundly. Emotional courage is not pretending fear does not exist. It is allowing yourself to remain open-hearted despite fear. It is continuing to believe in connection after heartbreak. It is allowing yourself to be seen authentically after rejection. It is speaking your truth even when your voice shakes. It is setting boundaries even when people misunderstand you. It is asking for support instead of isolating. It is choosing softness in a world obsessed with emotional armor. And perhaps one of the greatest myths about vulnerability is the belief that vulnerability means weakness or oversharing. But vulnerability is not emotional chaos. It is emotional honesty paired with self-awareness. It is knowing when to open your heart and when to protect your peace. It is understanding that your story deserves safe spaces, not careless exposure. Vulnerability without boundaries becomes emotional flooding. Boundaries without vulnerability become emotional isolation. Healing happens when you learn to balance both. As you begin removing emotional armor slowly, something remarkable starts happening inside you. Your relationships begin feeling more genuine because you stop performing perfection. Your conversations deepen because you stop pretending everything is fine. Your confidence becomes more stable because it is no longer entirely dependent on external validation. You stop measuring your worth through productivity, appearance, achievement, or approval. Instead, you begin grounding your self-worth in your humanity. This shift changes the way you love as well. You stop trying to earn affection through self-sacrifice. You stop abandoning your emotional needs to maintain relationships. You stop mistaking emotional inconsistency for passion. You stop seeing boundaries as selfish. Instead, You begin understanding that healthy love requires emotional honesty, mutual respect, trust, empathy, and emotional safety. Love no longer becomes a place where you disappear. It becomes a place where you are allowed to exist fully. And the deeper your self-trust grows, the less emotionally reactive you become to outside judgment. Criticism still hurts sometimes. Rejection still stings sometimes. Disappointment still feels painful sometimes. But those experiences no longer define your identity. Because you begin understanding something life-changing. Other people's inability to recognize your worth does not reduce your worth. This understanding creates a softer, more grounded kind of confidence. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but calm confidence. The kind that allows you to walk away from spaces that require you to betray yourself. The kind that allows you to rest without guilt. The kind that allows you to express emotions without shame. The kind that allows you to stop apologizing for your sensitivity. The kind that allows you to reclaim your voice after years of silence. You may notice that as your emotional armor softens, your ability to experience joy also returns. Because joy itself requires vulnerability. To feel joy fully means allowing yourself to be emotionally present instead of emotionally guarded. It means allowing beauty to touch you without immediately preparing for loss. It means laughing freely without self-consciousness. It means loving without constantly calculating the risk. It means trusting yourself enough to experience life wholeheartedly instead of defensively. And yet vulnerability will still feel uncomfortable sometimes because your nervous system remembers the moments when openness led to pain. Healing does not erase your history. It transforms your relationship with it. Instead of allowing past wounds to dictate your future, you begin responding to your fears with compassion and awareness. You stop asking, "How do I avoid ever getting hurt again?" and begin asking, "How do I remain connected to myself even when life feels painful?" That question changes everything because emotional resilience is not about avoiding discomfort. It is about learning how to stay emotionally grounded during discomfort. It is about trusting that you can survive difficult emotions without abandoning yourself. It is about recognizing that vulnerability and strength are not opposites. They are deeply connected. You begin seeing that some of the strongest people you know are not the ones who never cry, never struggle, never need support. The strongest people are often the ones courageous enough to remain emotionally honest. The ones willing to begin again after failure. The ones willing to love after loss. The ones willing to say, "I need help." The ones willing to let themselves be seen authentically rather than hiding behind perfection. And maybe this is the true meaning of emotional freedom, not becoming untouchable, but becoming fully alive. No longer trapped behind emotional armor. No longer performing strength while secretly feeling disconnected. No longer shrinking yourself to avoid judgment. No longer sacrificing authenticity for approval. Because the moment you stop treating vulnerability like an enemy, your entire relationship with yourself begins transforming. Your sensitivity becomes emotional wisdom. Your boundaries become self-respect. Your softness becomes graceful power. Your honesty becomes liberation. Your courage becomes contagious. Your life becomes less about managing appearances and more about experiencing genuine connection, inner peace, emotional clarity, and wholehearted living. And slowly, almost quietly, you begin realizing that the armor you once believed protected you was never your true strength. Your true strength was always your ability to remain open-hearted despite everything life has asked you to survive. Your true strength was always your willingness to heal instead of harden. Your true strength was always your brave heart, your emotional depth, your feminine resilience, your ability to keep loving, growing, trusting, and becoming after every difficult season. And as this understanding settles into your soul, something softens inside you. You breathe differently. You speak differently. You love differently. You stop fighting your humanity and begin honoring it. You stop trying to become less emotional and begin becoming more emotionally free. And for the first time in a long time, you no longer feel trapped behind the walls you built to survive, because you finally understand that healing was never about becoming invulnerable. It was always about learning how to live with an open heart without losing yourself in the process. Chapter 5. Mind the Gap, Disruptive Engagement and Reconnection. There are moments in life when you suddenly realize that you have drifted far away from yourself, not in one dramatic event, not through one catastrophic heartbreak, but through 1,000 quiet disconnections that happen slowly over time. Moments when you ignored your intuition to keep the peace. Moments when you stayed silent to avoid conflict. Moments when you smiled while your heart was breaking. Moments when you pretended not to care because caring felt too vulnerable. And before you knew it, there was a painful distance between who you truly are and who you learned to become in order to survive. This distance becomes exhausting because deep inside, your soul always knows when you are abandoning yourself. You can feel it in the heaviness in your chest after saying yes when you meant no. You can feel it in the anxiety that appears after constantly shrinking your truth. You can feel it in relationships where you feel emotionally lonely despite being physically present. You can feel it in the mirror when your eyes look tired even after resting. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that many people become so accustomed to this emotional disconnection that they begin calling it normal. You may wake up every day fulfilling responsibilities, answering messages, caring for others, managing work, supporting relationships, handling endless emotional labor, yet quietly feel disconnected from joy, disconnected from peace, disconnected from your own emotional clarity. And because modern life rewards busyness and performance, many people never pause long enough to ask the deeper question, when did I stop feeling connected to myself? Instead, they continue functioning while emotionally starving, overgiving while secretly depleted, performing confidence while privately questioning their worth. This emotional gap becomes especially painful because human beings are wired for connection, not only connection with others, but connection with themselves. Your heart longs to feel emotionally safe inside your own body. Your nervous system longs for honesty, rest, authenticity, tenderness, and belonging. But when life becomes centered around performance, perfectionism, people-pleasing, emotional armor, and fear of judgment, you slowly lose that sense of inner connection. You begin living from survival mode instead of emotional presence. And survival mode changes everything. In survival mode, you stop listening to your emotions and start managing appearances. You become hyper-aware of what others expect while becoming disconnected from what you genuinely need. Your decisions become rooted in fear rather than self-trust. You overthink constantly because your nervous system no longer feels safe enough to relax. You seek validation because you no longer feel anchored in your own worthiness. You become emotionally reactive because your inner world is carrying unresolved tension. And over time, this emotional disconnection creates a painful cycle. The more disconnected you become from yourself, the harder it becomes to create authentic connection with others. You may notice this in relationships where conversations stay on the surface because vulnerability feels risky. You may notice it in friendships where you support everyone emotionally while secretly hiding your own struggles. You may notice it in romantic relationships where you crave deeper intimacy but fear being fully seen. You may notice it in motherhood, where you love deeply but quietly feel pressure to appear endlessly capable. You may notice it in leadership, where you fear that showing emotion might make you appear weak. And perhaps most painfully, you may notice it in the relationship with yourself, where self-criticism has become louder than self-compassion. But what if emotional reconnection begins not with becoming someone new, but with returning to the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to belong? What if healing is not about fixing yourself, but about reconnecting with your own humanity? Because the truth is, Disconnection often happens when you betray your authentic emotions repeatedly. Every time you silence your truth, every time you dismiss your feelings, every time you ignore your boundaries, every time you pretend not to hurt, a small emotional gap forms inside you. And eventually, that gap becomes wide enough that you no longer recognize yourself fully. This is why emotional awareness matters so deeply. Healing begins when you become willing to notice the gap instead of avoiding it. Notice the moments when your body tightens in situations that drain you. Notice the relationships where you constantly feel the need to perform. Notice the exhaustion that follows emotional suppression. Notice the anxiety that appears when you seek validation outside yourself. Notice the loneliness that comes from hiding your truth. Awareness becomes the first bridge back to yourself. And this awareness can feel uncomfortable at first because emotional honesty disrupts old patterns. It disrupts the habit of pretending everything is okay. It disrupts the habit of overfunctioning while emotionally overwhelmed. It disrupts the habit of earning worth through productivity. It disrupts the habit of keeping peace at the expense of your own peace. Healing often feels disruptive before it feels peaceful, because growth asks you to stop surviving in ways that are hurting your spirit. You may begin noticing that many of your emotional patterns were never random. The fear of disappointing others may come from years of associating love with approval. The fear of vulnerability may come from experiences where openness was met with criticism or rejection. The fear of boundaries may come from guilt, abandonment wounds, or the belief that your needs make you difficult. The constant pressure to achieve may come from trying to outrun feelings of inadequacy. And once you begin understanding your patterns with compassion instead of shame, your healing journey deepens. You stop seeing yourself as broken and begin seeing yourself as someone who adapted emotionally in order to survive. This shift changes your inner dialogue completely. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" with frustration, you begin asking, "What pain taught me this?" with tenderness. That single emotional shift creates space for self-compassion. And self-compassion becomes one of the most powerful tools for reconnection because it allows you to stop fighting yourself internally. You begin learning how to sit with your emotions instead of escaping them immediately. You begin allowing sadness without seeing it as weakness. You begin allowing uncertainty without needing to control everything. You begin allowing vulnerability without automatically assuming it will lead to rejection. You begin understanding that emotional discomfort is not proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes discomfort is simply the nervous system adjusting to honesty after years of emotional suppression. And slowly, as this reconnection deepens, your relationships begin changing too. Because when you reconnect with yourself, you stop participating in relationships that require self-abandonment. You stop shrinking your truth to maintain false harmony. You stop tolerating emotional inconsistency disguised as love. You stop confusing people-pleasing with kindness. Instead, you begin creating relationships rooted in authenticity, emotional safety, empathy, mutual respect, and openness. You may also notice how transformative it feels to be emotionally present with someone instead of emotionally performing for them. To speak honestly instead of carefully managing perception. To express needs without shame. To admit fear without embarrassment. To say, "This hurt me," instead of pretending not to care. This kind of vulnerability creates genuine connection because people do not feel deeply connected to perfection. They feel deeply connected to honesty. And perhaps one of the most beautiful parts of emotional reconnection is learning that vulnerability does not weaken your power, it deepens it. The world often teaches women to associate power with emotional detachment, endless capability, emotional control, and self-sacrifice. But real feminine strength is far more grounded than that. Real strength is emotional presence. Real strength is knowing your worth without needing to dominate others. Real strength is remaining connected to your heart without losing your boundaries. Real strength is allowing softness and self-respect to coexist. This understanding changes how you move through life. You stop measuring your value solely through achievement and begin valuing your emotional well-being too. You stop glorifying exhaustion. You stop treating rest like a reward you must earn. You stop apologizing for your emotional needs. You stop believing that being lovable requires becoming less complicated, less sensitive, less human. And there is a profound emotional liberation that happens when you stop abandoning yourself to maintain connection with others. At first, it feels unfamiliar because many people are conditioned to prioritize external harmony over internal honesty. But eventually, something stabilizes inside you. Your nervous system becomes calmer because your actions align more closely with your truth. Your confidence becomes more grounded because it is no longer dependent entirely on outside approval. Your relationships become more authentic because they are no longer built on performance. You may still experience fear sometimes. Fear does not disappear overnight. There will still be moments when setting boundaries feels uncomfortable, moments when vulnerability feels risky, moments when your old survival patterns try to pull you back into emotional hiding. But healing is not about never feeling fear again. Healing is about no longer allowing fear to control your identity. And each time you choose reconnection over disconnection, your emotional resilience strengthens. Every time you pause and ask yourself what you truly feel instead of what others expect you to feel. Every time you honor your exhaustion instead of overriding it. Every time you express your truth respectfully instead of suppressing it. Every time you choose authenticity over approval. Every time you allow yourself to be emotionally seen without shame. These moments become acts of healing. You begin discovering that self-trust is built through these small daily choices. Through listening to your intuition. Through honoring your emotional limits. Through protecting your peace. Through choosing relationships that nourish rather than deplete you. Through allowing yourself to exist without constant self-correction. Through recognizing that your worth is not negotiable. And the more emotionally connected you become to yourself, the less emotionally dependent you become on external validation. Compliments feel good, but no longer define your worth. Criticism hurts sometimes, but no longer destroys your identity. Rejection disappoints you, but no longer convinces you that you are unlovable. You begin grounding yourself internally rather than emotionally outsourcing your self-worth to other people's opinions. This grounded sense of self creates a different kind of presence in the world. You walk differently, speak differently, love differently, not because you become perfect, but because you become authentic. Your energy softens while your boundaries strengthen. Your vulnerability deepens while your self-respect becomes clearer. Your relationships become more intentional because you no longer seek connection through performance. You seek connection through truth. And perhaps this is the deeper invitation hidden inside emotional healing. Not to become fearless, but to become fully connected to yourself again. To stop treating your emotions like problems to solve and start treating them like messages worth listening to. To stop viewing vulnerability as something to avoid and begin seeing it as the bridge back to intimacy, creativity, compassion, and inner peace. Because emotional disconnection often begins the moment you decide your authentic self is too risky to reveal. And emotional reconnection begins the moment you decide your truth matters more than maintaining a perfect image. It begins when you stop asking, "How do I make everyone comfortable?" and start asking, "What does my soul need in order to feel alive again?" Maybe your soul needs rest. Maybe it needs honesty. Maybe it needs boundaries. Maybe it needs forgiveness. Maybe it needs grief. Maybe it needs courage. Maybe it simply needs permission to exist without constantly proving its value. And as you continue reconnecting with yourself, life begins feeling different, not because every problem disappears, but because you are no longer emotionally abandoning yourself while facing them. You become emotionally grounded instead of emotionally fragmented. You become deeply connected instead of constantly performing connection. You become wholehearted instead of divided between who you are and who you think you must be. The noise of comparison begins quieting. The pressure to perform begins softening. The fear of judgment loses some of its control. And in that quiet emotional space, something beautiful begins emerging again. Your authentic voice, your emotional clarity, your self-trust, your feminine resilience, your radiant humanity. And perhaps this is the real transformation, not becoming someone entirely different, but finally returning to yourself after years of disconnection, with more wisdom, more compassion, more courage, more softness, and a deeper understanding that healing was never about becoming perfect. It was always about becoming whole again. Chapter 6. Disruptive Engagement. Daring greatly at work. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come only from hard work. It comes from spending every single day trying to prove that you deserve to be in the room. It comes from walking into meetings already questioning your worth before speaking. It comes from rehearsing your ideas repeatedly in your mind because you are afraid of sounding unintelligent. It comes from shrinking your voice to avoid appearing too emotional, too ambitious, too sensitive, or too much. It comes from smiling professionally while silently carrying pressure, burnout, insecurity, and the constant fear of making mistakes in environments that reward perfection but rarely make space for humanity. And over time, this pressure creates an invisible emotional burden, one that many people carry quietly while continuing to function, achieve, lead, care for others, and perform competence every single day. You may know this feeling deeply, the pressure to always appear capable, composed, productive, and emotionally controlled, even when your inner world feels overwhelmed. You may have learned that success requires emotional suppression, that leadership means never appearing uncertain, that asking for help signals weakness, that confidence must always look polished and fearless. And because of this, many people begin treating vulnerability like a threat instead of recognizing it as one of the most powerful tools for authentic leadership, creativity, trust, innovation, and connection. The workplace often becomes one of the clearest mirrors reflecting your relationship with worthiness. Because work is not only about tasks, goals, and performance. It is also about visibility, fear, identity, validation, comparison, rejection, courage, and belonging. Every time you speak up in a meeting, submit an idea, apply for an opportunity, ask for fair treatment, set boundaries, lead a team, or express creativity, vulnerability is present. There is always emotional risk involved in being seen. And yet many professional environments quietly teach people to disconnect from vulnerability completely. They reward emotional armor. They reward overworking, emotional detachment, perfectionism, endless productivity, and constant performance. People are often praised for sacrificing rest, ignoring emotional exhaustion, pushing through burnout, and pretending they are unaffected by stress. But beneath many high-performing environments exists a hidden culture of fear, fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, fear of criticism, fear of being replaceable, fear of not being enough. This fear creates emotional disconnection not only from others, but from yourself. You stop asking what truly fulfills you and start focusing entirely on external achievement. Your nervous system begins operating in survival mode. You become emotionally hypervigilant, constantly trying to avoid mistakes, constantly comparing yourself to others, constantly wondering whether you are doing enough, achieving enough, proving enough. And even after accomplishments, the feeling of enoughness rarely arrives because self-worth built only on performance is fragile. You may notice how this pressure especially affects emotionally aware and deeply caring people. People who naturally want to contribute meaningfully, support others, create impact, and do their work with integrity often carry invisible emotional labor. They overprepare because they fear disappointing others. They overwork because rest feels unsafe. They hesitate to ask for support because they fear appearing incapable. They become perfectionists because criticism feels deeply personal. And slowly, work stops feeling like expression and starts feeling like emotional survival. This emotional survival mode becomes dangerous because it disconnects you from creativity, intuition, and authentic confidence. Fear-based environments rarely create innovation because fear makes people protect themselves instead of expressing themselves. When people feel emotionally unsafe, they stop taking healthy risks. They stop speaking honestly. They stop bringing original ideas. They stop asking difficult questions. They become more focused on avoiding failure than creating meaningful growth. And perhaps you have experienced this personally. Moments when you stayed silent despite having valuable insight, because fear whispered that your voice was not important enough. Moments when you accepted unfair treatment because you doubted your worth. Moments when you exhausted yourself trying to prove your value to people who constantly moved the standards higher. Moments when imposter syndrome convinced you that your success was temporary, accidental, or undeserved. Moments when you felt emotionally invisible despite working endlessly. But what if the very thing you were taught to hide, your vulnerability, your emotional awareness, your humanity, your openness, is actually one of your greatest professional strengths? Because true leadership is not built through perfection. It is built through trust. And trust cannot exist where vulnerability is absent. Think about the people who made you feel safest, most inspired, most respected in professional spaces. They were likely not the people pretending to know everything. They were probably the people willing to listen, willing to admit mistakes, willing to lead with empathy, willing to create emotional safety for others. Real leadership is not dominance. Real leadership is connection. It is the ability to remain emotionally grounded while creating space for honesty, collaboration, creativity, and growth. And this changes the entire way you approach work. Instead of seeing vulnerability as weakness, you begin seeing it as courageous engagement. Speaking up becomes vulnerability. Asking questions becomes vulnerability. Setting boundaries becomes vulnerability. Delegating instead of controlling everything becomes vulnerability. Admitting uncertainty becomes vulnerability. Giving honest feedback becomes vulnerability. Receiving feedback without collapsing into shame becomes vulnerability. Every meaningful professional relationship depends on emotional courage. One of the greatest workplace myths is the belief that emotions should be completely separated from professionalism. But emotions already exist in every workplace, whether acknowledged or not. Fear exists. Shame exists. Anxiety exists. Ambition exists. Insecurity exists. Jealousy exists. Excitement exists. Hope exists. The difference is whether these emotions are processed consciously or hidden beneath emotional armor. Ignoring emotions does not create stronger workplaces. It creates disconnected workplaces. You may notice how emotional suppression eventually damages both confidence and connection. When you constantly silence your needs to appear agreeable, resentment builds. When you avoid difficult conversations to keep peace, tension grows silently. When you fear failure so deeply that you never take risks, your creativity shrinks. When you tie your worth entirely to achievement, burnout becomes inevitable. And when emotional exhaustion becomes chronic, even success begins feeling empty. This is why wholehearted leadership begins internally. It begins with the courage to stop defining your worth solely through productivity. It begins with understanding that your value as a human being is deeper than your performance metrics. It begins with self-trust. Because when your identity depends entirely on external validation, every criticism feels like emotional danger. Every mistake feels like proof of inadequacy. Every rejection feels personal. But when your worth becomes internally grounded, your nervous system softens. You become more resilient, more creative, more emotionally free. And something remarkable happens when you stop operating from constant fear of not being enough. You become more authentic in professional spaces. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You stop shrinking your ideas to make others comfortable. You stop seeking perfection before speaking. You begin trusting your voice. This does not mean fear disappears completely. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is allowing yourself to remain visible despite fear. It is daring greatly, even when uncertainty exists. It is applying for opportunities before feeling fully ready. It is leading conversations you once avoided. It is saying, "I need support," instead of silently drowning in pressure. It is trusting your perspective even when comparison tries to silence you. And comparison becomes especially dangerous in professional environments because workplaces often encourage constant measurement: titles, achievements, salaries, promotions, recognition. It becomes easy to look around and feel behind, inadequate, or invisible. But comparison disconnects you from your own path. It convinces you that your worth is determined by someone else's timeline. And once you begin chasing validation through comparison, inner peace becomes impossible. Healing this pattern requires intentional emotional awareness. You begin asking yourself deeper questions. What actually matters to me? What kind of work aligns with my values? What environment allows me to feel emotionally safe and creatively alive? What success feels meaningful rather than performative? These questions reconnect you with purpose instead of performance. And purpose changes everything. Because when your work becomes connected to authenticity rather than solely approval, your relationship with success transforms. You stop chasing achievement only to prove worthiness. You begin creating, leading, contributing, and growing from a place of self-respect and alignment. Work becomes less about survival and more about expression. You may also begin noticing how powerful emotional honesty becomes in leadership itself. Teams thrive where people feel psychologically safe. Creativity grows where people are not punished for imperfection. Collaboration deepens where empathy exists. Innovation increases where fear decreases. And emotional courage creates these environments. Imagine the freedom of no longer needing to appear flawless at all times. Imagine leading with both confidence and humanity. Imagine allowing yourself to learn publicly instead of pretending to know everything. Imagine creating boundaries that protect your emotional well-being instead of sacrificing yourself for approval. Imagine trusting that rest, softness, emotional awareness, and vulnerability do not weaken your power. They deepen your sustainability. This emotional shift also transforms the way you respond to failure. Because failure becomes inevitable anytime you dare greatly. If you are creating, leading, speaking, building, loving, or trying something meaningful, you will eventually experience disappointment, criticism, mistakes, or rejection. But emotionally resilient people do not interpret failure as identity. They interpret it as growth, information, redirection, and learning. And this matters deeply because shame often follows professional setbacks. One mistake can trigger old wounds of inadequacy. One rejection can awaken fears of unworthiness. One difficult conversation can reactivate self-doubt. But emotional resilience allows you to remain connected to yourself during these moments. Instead of spiraling into self-rejection, you respond with self-compassion. Instead of collapsing into perfectionism, you return to authenticity. Instead of abandoning yourself emotionally, you stay grounded. This grounding changes how you carry yourself in every room. You no longer seek permission to exist confidently. You stop waiting until you feel fearless before taking action. You stop believing that vulnerability disqualifies you from leadership. You stop treating emotional sensitivity as weakness. Instead, you begin recognizing emotional intelligence as a form of wisdom. And perhaps one of the most empowering realizations of all is understanding that your softness and your strength were never enemies. You can be compassionate and powerful. You can be emotionally aware and professionally successful. You can lead with empathy and still maintain boundaries. You can care deeply without abandoning yourself. You can remain open-hearted without losing authority. You can be both graceful and grounded. The more emotionally connected you become to yourself, the more naturally your confidence evolves. Not performative confidence, not superiority, but calm, rooted confidence. The kind that comes from self-trust rather than external validation. The kind that allows you to walk into rooms without constantly questioning your worth. The kind that allows you to recover from setbacks without losing your identity. The kind that allows you to speak honestly instead of strategically hiding your humanity. And this grounded confidence becomes contagious. Because when one person chooses authenticity over perfection, it gives others permission to do the same. When one leader admits uncertainty without shame, it creates emotional safety. When one person sets healthy boundaries, it challenges cultures built on burnout. When one person chooses wholehearted engagement instead of emotional armor, connection deepens. This is how meaningful transformation begins, not through becoming invulnerable, but through daring greatly despite vulnerability. Through choosing emotional honesty in spaces that reward performance. Through protecting your humanity in environments that often prioritize productivity over well-being. Through remembering that your worth is not measured solely by output, titles, praise, or perfection. Because at the end of the day, the most fulfilled people are rarely the ones who avoided vulnerability completely. They are often the ones who remained connected to themselves while navigating uncertainty. The ones who allowed themselves to create imperfectly, lead authentically, rest unapologetically, speak courageously, and grow continuously. And maybe that is the deeper invitation hidden inside your work life. Not simply to achieve more, but to become more emotionally free while achieving. To stop sacrificing your inner peace for external success. To stop abandoning your emotional truth in order to appear endlessly capable. To stop believing that exhaustion is proof of worthiness. Because you were never meant to lose yourself while building your life. You were meant to build a life where your authenticity, emotional well-being, creativity, courage, and humanity could coexist. A life where your success does not require self-betrayal. A life where your voice matters. A life where your emotional wisdom becomes strength instead of shame. And as you continue walking through professional spaces with greater vulnerability, greater self-respect, greater emotional clarity, and greater courage, something inside you changes permanently. You stop performing confidence and begin embodying it. You stop seeking constant permission and begin trusting yourself. You stop living from fear of inadequacy and begin living from enoughness. And in that quiet transformation, you no longer feel like someone trying desperately to prove value to the world. You begin feeling like someone who already understands her worth, someone emotionally grounded, deeply connected, resilient, authentic, wholehearted, and finally brave enough to take up space without apologizing for being fully human. Chapter 7. Wholehearted Parenting, Daring Greatly and Raising Children of Worth. The deepest fear many parents carry is not the fear of failing at schedules, routines, school meetings, or responsibilities. It is the quiet fear that somehow, despite loving their children deeply, they may unintentionally pass down the same wounds they spent years trying to heal inside themselves. Because parenting has a way of revealing everything unresolved within you. It reveals your fears, your emotional triggers, your insecurities, your relationship with worthiness, your perfectionism, your anxiety, your self-doubt, your emotional patterns, your relationship with control, and even the pain you thought you buried long ago. And this realization can feel overwhelming because suddenly parenting becomes more than raising a child. It becomes a mirror reflecting the emotional world you carry inside yourself. You may notice this in small moments at first, moments when your child cries loudly in public and embarrassment rises in your chest before compassion does. Moments when their mistakes trigger your frustration because you secretly fear judgment from others. Moments when their emotions overwhelm you because you were never taught how to safely express your own emotions growing up. Moments when you become emotionally reactive not because you are a bad parent, but because your nervous system is exhausted, overstimulated, and carrying years of emotional pressure. And in these moments, many people quietly begin believing they must become perfect parents in order to raise emotionally healthy children. But perfection has never been what children truly need. Children do not need flawless parents. They need emotionally present parents. They need connection more than performance. They need authenticity more than image. They need emotional safety more than impossible standards. Yet so many parents spend years trying to appear endlessly capable while silently drowning in guilt, pressure, comparison, and emotional exhaustion. The world constantly tells you that good parenting means doing more, controlling more, achieving more, sacrificing more, managing more, giving more, until eventually many parents lose themselves completely in the process of trying to become enough for everyone else. And this emotional depletion becomes dangerous because children do not only learn from your words, they absorb your relationship with yourself. They notice how you speak about your body. They notice how you respond to mistakes. They notice whether you rest or constantly overwork. They notice whether you express emotions openly or suppress them. They notice whether love feels conditional upon achievement or naturally available through connection. They notice whether vulnerability is treated as weakness or as part of being human. This is why wholehearted parenting begins not with controlling children perfectly, but with healing your own relationship with worthiness. Because when you constantly feel not enough inside yourself, parenting becomes driven by fear instead of connection. Fear of failing, fear of judgment, fear of raising imperfect children, fear of not doing enough, fear of emotional mistakes, fear of repeating painful cycles. And fear-based parenting often creates emotional disconnection, not because love is absent, but because fear makes emotional presence difficult. You may find yourself becoming hyper-focused on performance, grades, achievements, behavior, appearances, success, external validation, trying desperately to protect your child from discomfort, disappointment, rejection, or failure. But the truth is, children do not build resilience by avoiding vulnerability completely. They build resilience through emotional support while experiencing vulnerability safely. They learn courage not by never falling, but by discovering they are still worthy even when they do. And perhaps this is one of the most powerful shifts in parenting, realizing that your role is not to create perfect children, but emotionally grounded children. Children who know their worth is not dependent entirely on achievement. Children who feel safe expressing emotions. Children who understand that mistakes do not erase lovability. Children who trust themselves. Children who feel connected instead of constantly performing for approval. But in order to create that emotional environment, you must first begin offering those same truths to yourself. Because children can sense emotional incongruence. They can feel when love is mixed with pressure. They can feel when emotional safety depends on perfection. They can feel when affection disappears during disappointment. And even if these patterns are unintentional, they shape the emotional atmosphere children grow up inside. Many people were raised in environments where emotions were minimized, dismissed, criticized, or ignored. Some were taught to suppress sadness. Some were shamed for anger. Some learned that vulnerability invited judgment. Some learned that achievement created love and approval. Some learned that emotional needs made them difficult. And without conscious healing, these patterns often continue quietly across generations. This is why emotional awareness matters so profoundly in parenting. Because when your child expresses big emotions, your reaction often reveals your own emotional conditioning. If vulnerability feels unsafe inside you, your child's vulnerability may trigger discomfort. If you learn to associate mistakes with shame, your child's mistakes may unconsciously activate frustration or fear. If you were taught that worthiness depends on success, you may unknowingly pressure your child toward perfectionism. But healing changes this. Healing allows you to pause before reacting automatically. It allows you to respond with curiosity instead of control. It allows you to see emotions not as problems to eliminate, but as experiences to guide compassionately. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this emotion?" you begin asking, "What is this emotion trying to communicate?" And this shift creates emotional safety. Because emotional safety is not created through perfection. It is created through consistent connection, empathy, honesty, boundaries, accountability, and presence. Children do not need parents who never make mistakes. They need parents willing to repair after mistakes. Parents willing to apologize sincerely. Parents willing to model emotional honesty. Parents willing to remain connected even during difficult emotions. One of the greatest gifts you can offer a child is the experience of being fully seen without needing to perform worthiness constantly. Imagine growing up believing that love does not disappear when you struggle. Imagine learning early that your emotions are not shameful. Imagine understanding that mistakes are part of growth instead of proof of inadequacy. Imagine being taught self-compassion alongside responsibility. Imagine learning that vulnerability and strength can exist together. This kind of parenting transforms emotional development because it teaches children that their humanity is not something to hide. They stop believing they must become perfect in order to be accepted. They stop associating worth solely with external success. They begin developing inner security rather than constantly chasing validation. And yet, wholehearted parenting also requires boundaries. Because emotional safety does not mean endless permissiveness. Boundaries are part of love. Boundaries teach self-respect, responsibility, emotional regulation, and trust. But there is a profound difference between discipline rooted in shame and discipline rooted in connection. Shame attacks identity. It says, "You are bad." Healthy accountability addresses behavior while protecting worthiness. It says, "This behavior was hurtful, but you are still loved." That distinction matters deeply because shame disconnects children from themselves. It teaches them to hide mistakes instead of learning from them. It creates fear instead of trust. But emotionally connected accountability teaches responsibility without emotional abandonment. You may notice how healing your own shame changes the way you parent completely. When you stop seeing mistakes as proof of failure inside yourself, you become less reactive to imperfection in your children. You become more patient with emotional growth. You stop expecting emotional maturity from children while denying emotional compassion to yourself. You begin modeling emotional resilience rather than emotional suppression. And perhaps one of the hardest parts of parenting is accepting that vulnerability cannot be removed from your child's life completely. They will experience disappointment. They will face rejection. They will make mistakes. They will feel insecure sometimes. They will experience heartbreak, uncertainty, fear, embarrassment, loneliness, comparison, and emotional pain. No amount of love can eliminate vulnerability from the human experience. But what changes everything is whether they move through those experiences feeling emotionally alone or emotionally supported. Because resilience grows through connection. Children become emotionally stronger when they know they are loved even during difficult moments. They become more confident when they feel emotionally safe enough to fail, try again, express emotions, and ask for support. This also means allowing yourself to release impossible parenting expectations. You were never meant to carry the burden of getting everything right all the time. Parenting while emotionally exhausted, overstimulated, unsupported, and pressured by unrealistic societal standards is incredibly difficult. And many parents secretly carry shame for struggling emotionally while trying to care for everyone else. You may feel guilty for needing rest. Guilty for wanting space. Guilty for losing patience sometimes. Guilty for not always feeling grateful every second. Guilty for still carrying your own wounds while trying to raise emotionally healthy children. But guilt becomes destructive when it turns into chronic self-punishment instead of self-awareness. You are allowed to be human while parenting. You are allowed to need support too. And perhaps your children do not need to witness perfection from you. Perhaps what they truly need is to witness emotional authenticity, to see someone who apologizes when wrong, someone who regulates emotions imperfectly but intentionally, someone who values self-respect alongside kindness, someone who allows softness without shame, someone who models boundaries, someone who practices self-compassion, someone who demonstrates that healing is lifelong. Because children often learn emotional resilience not from lectures, but from watching how adults navigate life. They learn by observing how you respond to stress, conflict, disappointment, uncertainty, failure, grief, joy, rest, and vulnerability. Your relationship with yourself quietly becomes part of their emotional blueprint. And this is why your own healing matters so deeply. Not because you must become flawless before parenting, but because emotionally aware healing interrupts cycles of shame, silence, emotional neglect, and perfectionism. Every time you choose self-compassion instead of self-hatred, you create change. Every time you repair after emotional disconnection, you create change. Every time you allow emotions without shame, you create change. Every time you choose connection over control, you create change. You begin understanding that wholehearted parenting is not about constantly managing your child's image or achievements. It is about nurturing their sense of enoughness. It is about helping them develop emotional courage, self-trust, empathy, resilience, and authenticity. It is about teaching them that vulnerability is not weakness. It is about showing them that their value exists beyond performance. And slowly, as this understanding deepens, parenting begins feeling less like a constant test you are trying to pass and more like a relationship you are learning to experience wholeheartedly. You begin listening more deeply. You begin responding more intentionally. You begin softening unrealistic expectations placed upon yourself. You stop measuring your worth entirely through parenting perfection. You allow room for growth, repair, tenderness, humanity. There will still be difficult days. Days when exhaustion overwhelms patience. Days when fear returns. Days when old emotional patterns resurface unexpectedly. Days when you question yourself. But healing does not require never struggling again. Healing means remaining emotionally connected to yourself even while struggling. It means returning to compassion instead of shame. It means recognizing that your imperfections do not erase your love. And perhaps the most beautiful part of wholehearted parenting is this. When children feel emotionally safe enough to be themselves fully, they begin carrying a different kind of inner foundation into the world. They become less afraid of vulnerability, less dependent on external validation, less ashamed of emotions, more connected to empathy, more capable of authentic relationships, more resilient during uncertainty, more grounded in self-worth. And that kind of emotional inheritance is powerful because the world does not need more people pretending to be perfect while secretly feeling disconnected and unworthy. The world needs more emotionally grounded humans who know they are enough even in their imperfect humanity. And as you continue this journey, something shifts inside you too. You stop parenting from fear quite so often and begin parenting more from trust. Trust in connection. Trust in emotional honesty. Trust in your ability to repair. Trust in your child's resilience. Trust in your own healing journey. You begin understanding that the goal was never perfection. The goal was love with presence, boundaries with compassion, vulnerability with courage, guidance with empathy, and connection strong enough to remind both you and your children that worthiness has never needed to be earned through perfection in the first place. There comes a moment in every healing journey when you realize that the greatest battle was never truly against the world. It was against the painful belief that you were somehow not enough for love, not enough for belonging, not enough for peace, not enough for softness, not enough for rest, not enough for happiness. And perhaps even now, after everything you have listened to, after every vulnerable truth you have faced inside yourself, A quiet part of you is still wondering whether real transformation is actually possible for you. Because healing sounds beautiful in theory, but in real life it often feels messy, emotional, uncomfortable, uncertain, and deeply personal. Some days you feel powerful and emotionally free, and other days old fears return unexpectedly. Old insecurities whisper loudly again, old wounds reopen, old patterns resurface, and suddenly you question whether you are truly changing at all. But this is where most people misunderstand healing. Healing was never meant to make you perfect. It was never meant to erase your humanity. It was never about becoming someone who never struggles, never feels fear, never doubts herself, never experiences heartbreak, rejection, anxiety, disappointment, or emotional pain again. Healing is not becoming invulnerable. Healing is becoming more connected to yourself while moving through vulnerability. It is learning how to stay emotionally grounded during difficult moments instead of abandoning yourself emotionally every time life becomes uncomfortable. And perhaps that is the most courageous thing you can do in this lifetime, to remain connected to your heart in a world that constantly teaches emotional disconnection. Because somewhere along the way, many people learn to survive by hiding pieces of themselves. They learn to perform instead of express. They learn to please instead of feel. They learn to achieve instead of connect. They learn to harden instead of heal. And after years of emotional survival, many no longer recognize how exhausted they truly are. You may have spent years trying to become what everyone else needed you to be: dependable, strong, selfless, emotionally available for others while emotionally disconnected from yourself, constantly carrying responsibilities while quietly neglecting your own emotional needs. Maybe you became the helper, the caretaker, the overachiever, the peacemaker, the perfectionist, the emotionally strong one who secretly longed for someone to finally ask, "How are you really doing?" And perhaps because you became so skilled at surviving, people rarely noticed the invisible emotional weight you carried. But surviving is not the same as living wholeheartedly. There is a difference between functioning and feeling alive. There is a difference between appearing confident and actually trusting yourself deeply. There is a difference between being surrounded by people and feeling genuinely emotionally connected. And maybe the reason so many people feel emotionally exhausted today is because they have spent too long abandoning themselves in order to maintain approval, perfection, productivity, relationships, appearances, and expectations. Yet despite all of this, something inside you kept searching for more. Something inside you refused to fully give up on healing. Something inside you knew there had to be another way to live, a softer way, a more authentic way, a more emotionally free way. And that part of you matters deeply because your willingness to keep searching, even while hurting, even while afraid, even while exhausted, is evidence of your resilience. You may not always recognize your own courage because courage rarely looks dramatic while you are living it. Sometimes courage looks like getting out of bed after an emotionally overwhelming night. Sometimes courage looks like finally setting boundaries after years of people-pleasing. Sometimes courage looks like admitting you are struggling instead of pretending everything is fine. Sometimes courage looks like resting without guilt. Sometimes courage looks like leaving relationships that require self-abandonment. Sometimes courage looks like allowing yourself to feel emotions you spent years suppressing. Sometimes courage looks like forgiving yourself for being human. And perhaps this is what true emotional strength actually is, not emotional perfection, but emotional honesty. The willingness to stop running from your own humanity. The willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths compassionately. The willingness to love yourself even during moments when you feel uncertain, messy, emotional, imperfect, or unfinished. Because your worth was never dependent on becoming flawless. Your worth was never dependent on earning love through exhaustion. Your worth was never dependent on constant achievement, endless giving, emotional suppression, physical appearance, external validation, or people's approval. You were worthy before the world taught you to question yourself. You were worthy before comparison stole your peace. You were worthy before heartbreak made you guarded. You were worthy before shame convinced you to hide pieces of yourself. And once this understanding begins settling deeply into your soul, your life starts changing in subtle but powerful ways. You stop chasing relationships that require performance instead of authenticity. You stop apologizing for emotional needs that deserve care and respect. You stop believing that rest must always be earned. You stop abandoning your boundaries to avoid disappointing others. You stop seeing vulnerability as weakness and begin recognizing it as emotional bravery. You begin trusting yourself more, not because fear disappears completely, but because your relationship with fear changes. Fear no longer controls every decision. Fear no longer defines your identity. Fear no longer convinces you that you must stay small to stay safe. Instead, you begin moving through life with greater emotional awareness, greater self-respect, greater intentionality, and greater compassion toward yourself. And slowly, you start reclaiming pieces of yourself that survival once forced you to hide. Your voice becomes clearer. Your boundaries become stronger. Your self-worth becomes more grounded. Your relationships become more authentic. Your nervous system begins softening because you are no longer constantly fighting yourself internally. You become emotionally freer because you stop measuring your value through impossible standards. This transformation may happen quietly at first. One day you notice that you no longer over-explain your boundaries. One day you realize you are no longer seeking validation from people who consistently misunderstand you. One day you recognize that you are resting without guilt for the first time in years. One day you express a feeling honestly instead of suppressing it. One day you stop apologizing for taking up emotional space. One day you finally look at yourself with compassion instead of constant criticism. And these moments matter deeply because healing is rarely one giant breakthrough. More often, healing is 1,000 small moments where you choose yourself differently than before. 1,000 moments where you choose honesty over performance, rest over burnout, boundaries over resentment, self-compassion over shame, authenticity over approval, connection over emotional armor. There will still be difficult days. Days when old wounds feel tender again. Days when self-doubt returns. Days when insecurity speaks loudly. Days when vulnerability feels terrifying. Days when comparison steals your peace temporarily. Days when you question your progress. But difficult moments do not erase your healing. Emotional growth is not linear. Becoming emotionally grounded is a lifelong practice of returning to yourself again and again with compassion. And perhaps that is the real meaning of becoming emotionally empowered, not never struggling again, but no longer abandoning yourself during struggle, no longer speaking to yourself cruelly during pain, no longer seeing your emotions as weaknesses to eliminate, no longer believing that your sensitivity disqualifies you from strength. Because softness is not weakness. Emotional awareness is not weakness. Vulnerability is not weakness. Your ability to remain open-hearted after difficult experiences is one of the bravest things about you. You were never meant to live disconnected from yourself. You were never meant to constantly perform worthiness while secretly feeling emotionally empty. You were never meant to spend your life proving your value through exhaustion. You were meant to experience connection, peace, authenticity, joy, emotional safety, self-respect, meaningful relationships, inner freedom, and wholehearted living. And even if you are still healing, even if you are still learning how to trust yourself fully, even if you are still rebuilding after heartbreak, emotional neglect, shame, burnout, fear, rejection, or disappointment, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are becoming more emotionally aware, becoming more authentic, becoming more grounded, becoming more compassionate with yourself, becoming more courageous, becoming more whole. And maybe this audiobook found you at exactly the right moment, the moment when your soul was finally ready to stop surviving emotionally and start reconnecting with yourself more deeply. Maybe it arrived during a season when you needed to remember that your vulnerability is not something to hide. It is part of what makes connection possible. Maybe you needed permission to stop carrying impossible expectations alone. Maybe you needed someone to remind you that your humanity is not a flaw. So as this journey gently comes to rest, carry this truth with you. You do not need to become someone else to be worthy of love, peace, confidence, belonging, or emotional freedom. You only need the courage to stop abandoning yourself. The courage to honor your emotions instead of silencing them. The courage to set boundaries that protect your peace. The courage to let yourself be seen authentically. The courage to believe that who you are, even imperfectly, is already enough. And if this audiobook touched your heart, helped you feel emotionally seen, supported your healing journey, or reminded you of your inner strength, take a quiet moment to like and share this audiobook with someone who may also need these words right now. Someone silently carrying emotional exhaustion, shame, heartbreak, insecurity, or self-doubt behind a strong exterior. Because sometimes one compassionate message can become the beginning of someone's healing journey. And if you want more emotionally healing audiobooks, powerful self-help journeys, feminine empowerment stories, manifestation wisdom, emotional resilience guidance, and soulful transformational content designed to help you reconnect with your worth, your confidence, your peace, and your authentic self, subscribe to CliffNote Chronicles, where every story is created to remind you that healing is possible, vulnerability is powerful, and becoming your truest self is one of the most beautiful journeys you will ever experience. Until next time, keep choosing yourself gently, keep honoring your emotional truth courageously, keep protecting your peace unapologetically, keep loving yourself compassionately, and keep remembering that even in your most uncertain moments, you are still worthy, still resilient, still radiant, and still becoming everything your soul has been searching for all along.